The First Crusade was the first of a number of crusades that attempted to capture the Holy Lands, called by Pope Urban II in 1095. It started as a widespread pilgrimage in Western Christendom and ended as a military expedition by Roman Catholic Europe to regain the Holy Lands taken in the Muslim conquests of the Levant, ultimately resulting in the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. It was launched on the 27th of November 1095 by Pope Urban II with the primary goal of responding to an appeal from Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who requested that Western volunteers come to his aid and help to repel the invading Seljuk Turks from Anatolia. An additional goal soon became the principal objective, the Christian reconquest of the sacred city of Jerusalem and the Holy Land and the freeing of the Eastern Christians from Muslim rule. During the Crusade, knights, peasants and serfs from many regions of Western Europe traveled overland and by sea, first to Constantinople and then on towards Jerusalem. The Crusaders arrived at Jerusalem, launched an assault on the city, and captured it in July 1099, massacring many of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. They also established the Crusader states of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. The First Crusade was followed by the Second to the Ninth Crusades. It was also the first major step towards reopening international trade in the West since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, due to the First Crusade being largely concerned with Jerusalem, a city which had not been under Christian dominion for 461 years, and that the Crusader army, on seizure of lands, had refused to honor a brokered promise before the seizure to return gained lands to the control of the Byzantine Empire. The status of the First Crusade as defensive or aggressive in nature remains unanswered and controversial. The majority view is that it had elements of both in its nature. Origin. The origin of the Crusades in general, and particularly that of the First Crusade, is widely debated among historians. The confusion is partially due to the numerous armies in the First Crusade, and the lack of direct unity. The similar ideologies held the armies to similar goals, but the connections were rarely strong, and the unity broke down often. Crusades are most commonly linked to the political and social situation in 11th century Europe, the rise of a reform movement within the papacy, and the political and religious confrontation of Christianity and Islam in Europe and the Middle East. Christianity had spread throughout Europe, Africa, and the Middle East in late antiquity, but by the early 8th century Christian rule had become limited to Europe and Anatolia after the Muslim conquests. The Umayyad Caliphate had conquered Syria, Egypt, and North Africa from the predominantly Christian Byzantine Empire, and Hispania from the Visigothic kingdom. In North Africa, the Umayyad Empire eventually collapsed and a number of smaller Muslim kingdoms emerged, such as the Aghlabids, who attacked Italy in the 9th century. Pisa, Genoa, and the Principality of Catalonia began to battle various Muslim kingdoms for control of the Mediterranean basin, exemplified by the Mahdia campaign and battles at Majorca and Sardinia. Essentially, between the years 1096 and 1101 the Byzantine Greeks experienced the Crusade as it arrived at Constantinople in 3 separate waves. In the early summer of 1096, the first large unruly group arrived on the outskirts of Constantinople. This wave was reported to be undisciplined and ill-equipped as an army as noted in the People's Crusade. This first group is often called the Peasants' People's Crusade. It was led by Peter the Hermit and Walter Sansavoir and had no knowledge of or respect for the wishes of Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. The second wave was also not under the command of the emperor and was made up of a number of armies with their own commanders. Together, this group and the first wave numbered an estimated 60,000. The second wave was led led by Huai, Count of Vermandois, the brother of King Philip I of France. Also among the second wave were Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, and the army of Provençals. It was this second wave of crusaders which later passed through Asia Minor, captured Antioch in 1098 and finally took Jerusalem the 15th of July 1099. The third wave, composed of contingents from Lombardy, France, and Bavaria, arrived in Jerusalem in the early summer of 1101. Situation in Europe. At the western edge of Europe and of Islamic expansion, the reconquest in the Iberian Peninsula was well underway by the 11th century. It was intermittently ideological, as evidenced by the Codex Vigilanus compiled in 881. Increasingly in the 11th century, foreign knights, mostly from France, visited Iberia to assist the Christians in their efforts. Shortly before the First Crusade, Pope Urban II had encouraged the Iberian Christians to reconquer Tarragona, using much of the same symbolism and rhetoric that was later used to preach the crusade to the people of Europe. The heart of Western Europe had been stabilized after the Christianization of the Saxon, Viking, and Hungarian peoples by the end of the 10th century. However, the breakdown of the Carolingian Empire gave rise to an entire class of warriors who now had little to do but fight among themselves. The random violence of the knightly class was regularly condemned by the Church, and in response it established the peace and truce of God to prohibit fighting on certain days of the year. At the same time, the reform-minded papacy came into conflict with the Holy Roman Emperors, resulting in the investiture controversy. Popes such as Gregory VII justified the subsequent warfare against the emperor's partisans in theological terms. It became acceptable for the pope to utilize knights in the name of Christendom, not only against political enemies of the papacy, but also against Al-Andalus, or theoretically against the Seljuk dynasty in the east. To the east of Europe lay the Byzantine Empire, composed of Christians who had long followed a separate Orthodox rite. The Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches had been in schism since 1054. Historians have argued that the desire to impose Roman Church authority in the East may have been one of the goals of the Crusade. Although Urban II, who launched the First Crusade, never refers to such a goal in his letters on crusading, the Seljuk Turks had taken over almost all of Anatolia after the Byzantine defeat at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. However, their conquests were piecemeal and led by semi-independent warlords, rather than by the Sultan. A dramatic collapse of the empire's position on the eve of the Council of Clement brought Byzantium to the brink of disaster. By the mid-1090s, the Byzantine Empire was largely confined to Balkan Europe and the northwestern fringe of Anatolia, and faced Norman enemies in the west as well as Turks in the east. In response to the defeat at Manzikert and subsequent Byzantine losses in Anatolia in 1074, Pope Gregory VII had called for the Militares Christi to go to Byzantium's aid. This call was largely ignored and even opposed. The reason for this was that while the defeat at Manzikert was shocking, it had limited significance and did not lead to major difficulties for the Byzantine Empire, at least in the short term. Situation in the Middle East. Until the Crusaders' arrival, the Byzantines had continually fought the Seljuks and other Turkish dynasties for control of Anatolia and Syria. The Seljuks, who were Orthodox Sunni Muslims, had formerly ruled the Great Seljuk Empire, but by the time of the First Crusade it had divided into several smaller states after the death of Malik Shah I in 1092. Malik Shah was succeeded in the Anatolian Sultanate of Rum by Kilay Arslan and in Syria by his brother Tutushai, who died in 1095. Tutush's sons Fakh al-Mulk Radwin and Dukak inherited Aleppo and Damascus respectively, further dividing Syria amongst emirs antagonistic towards each other, as well as Kerbofa, the Atabeg of Mosul. Egypt and much of Palestine were controlled by the Arab Shiite Fatimid Caliphate, which was significantly smaller since the arrival of the Seljuks. Warfare between the Fatimids and Seljuks caused great disruption for the local Christians and for Western pilgrims. The Fatimids, under the nominal rule of Caliph al-Mustali but actually controlled by Vizier Ali Fd al-Shahanshah, had lost Jerusalem to the Seljuks in 1073. They recaptured it in 1098 from the Turkids, a smaller Turkish tribe associated with the Seljuks, just before the arrival of the Crusaders. Historiography. It is now impossible to assess exactly why the First Crusade occurred, although many possible causes have been suggested by historians, most recently J. Rubinstein. The historiography of the Crusades reflects attempts made by different historians to understand the Crusaders' complex causes and justifications. An early theory, the so-called Erdmann thesis, developed by German historian Karl Erdmann, directly linked the Crusades to the 11th century reform movements. This first theory claimed that the exportation of violence to the East, and the assistance to the struggling Byzantine Empire were the Crusaders' primary goals, and that the conquest of Jerusalem was more a secondary, popular goal. Generally, subsequent historians have either followed Erdmann, with further expansions upon his thesis, or rejected it. Some historians, such as Speros Vriouanis, have emphasized the influence of the rise of Islam generally, and the impact of the recent Seljuk onslaught specifically. Stephen Runciman argued that the crusade was motivated by a combination of theological justification for holy war and their general restlessness and taste for adventure, especially among the Normans and the younger sons of the French nobility who had no other opportunities. Runciman even implies that there was no immediate threat from the Islamic world, arguing that, in the middle of the 11th century, the lot of the Christians in Palestine had seldom been so pleasant. However, Runciman makes his argument only in reference to Palestine under the Fatimids c. 1029 to 1073, not under the Seljuks. Moreover, the source of his generally positive view of Palestinian Christians' lot in the later 11th century is unclear, as there were very few contemporary Christian sources from Palestine writing in this period, and surviving Christian sources deriving directly from Seljuk Palestine are virtually non-existent. In opposition to Runciman's argument, and on the basis of contemporary Jewish Chirogenies documents as well as later Muslim accounts, Moshe Gil argues that the Seljuk conquest and occupation of Palestine was a period of slaughter and vandalism, of economic hardship, and the uprooting of populations. Indeed, drawing upon earlier writers such as Ignatius of Melitene, Michael the Syrian had recorded that the Seljuks subjected Syria and the Palestinian coast to cruel destruction and pillage. Thomas Asbridge argues that the First Crusade was Pope Urban II's attempt to expand the power of the Church, and reunite the churches of Rome and Constantinople, which had been in schism since 1054. Asbridge, however, provides little evidence from Urban's own writings to bolster this claim, and Urban's four extant letters on crusading do not seem to express such a motive. According to Asbridge, the spread of Islam was unimportant because Islam and Christendom had coexisted for centuries in relative equanimity. Asbridge, however, fails to note that the recent Turkish conquests of Anatolia and southern Syria had shattered the tense but relatively stable balance of power that a somewhat revived Byzantine Empire had gradually developed with earlier Islamic powers over the course of the 10th and early 11th century. Following the defeat at Manzikert in 1071, Muslims had taken half of the Byzantine Empire's territory, and such strategically and religiously important cities as Antioch and Nicaea had only fallen to Muslims in the decade before the Council of Piacenza. Moreover, the harrowing accounts of the Turkish invasion and conquest of Anatolia recorded by such Eastern Christian chroniclers as John Skylitzes, Michael Atalayates, Matthew of Edessa, Michael the Syrian and others, which are summarized by Vreewanus, seem to contradict Asbridge's broad picture of equanimous coexistence between the Christian and Muslim worlds in the second half of the 11th century. Thomas Madin represents a view almost diametrically opposed to that of Asbridge. While the Crusade was certainly linked to church reform and attempts to assert papal authority, he argues that it was most importantly a pious struggle to liberate fellow Christians who, Madin claims, had suffered mightily at the hands of the Turks. This argument distinguishes the relatively recent violence and warfare that followed the conquests of the Turks from the general advance of Islam, the significance of which is dismissed by Runciman and Asbridge. Christopher Tyerman incorporates both arguments in his thesis, namely, that the Crusade developed out of church reform and theories of holy war as much as it was a response to conflicts with the Islamic world throughout Europe and the Middle East. In Jonathan Riley Smith's view, poor harvests, overpopulation, and a pre-existing movement towards colonizing the frontier areas of Europe also contributed to the Crusade. However, he also takes care to say that most commentators then and a minority of historians now have maintained that the chief motivation was a genuine idealism. Peter Frankopan has argued that the First Crusade has been fundamentally distorted by the attention paid by historians to Western sources, rather than Greek, Syriac, Armenian, Arabic and Hebrew material from the late 11th and 12th centuries. The expedition to Jerusalem, he argues, was conceived of not by the Pope but by the Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, in response to a dramatic deterioration of Byzantium's position in Asia Minor and also as a result of the estate of near-anarchy at the imperial court, where plans to depose Alexios or even murder him were an open secret by 1094. The appeal to Pope Urban II was a desperate move to shore up emperor and empire. Frankopan goes further, showing that the Crusades' primary military targets in Asia Minor, Nicaea and Antioch, required large numbers of men with experience of siege warfare, precisely the sort recruited by Urban during his preaching in France in 1095–6. The idea that the Crusades were a response to Islam dates back as far as 12th century historian William of Tyre, who began his chronicle with the fall of Jerusalem to Umar. Although the original Islamic conquests had taken place centuries before the First Crusade, more recent events would have been fresh in the minds of the European Christians of the time. For example, in 1009 the Church of the Holy Sepulchre had been destroyed by the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim by Amr Allah. Pope Sergius IV supposedly called for a military expedition in response, and in France, many Jewish communities were even attacked in a misdirected retaliation. Despite the Church's rebuilding after al-Hakim's death, and pilgrimages resuming, including the Great German Pilgrimage of 1064 to 1065, pilgrims continued to suffer attacks from local Muslims. In addition, The even more recent Turkish incursions into Anatolia and northern Syria were certainly viewed as devastating by Eastern Christian chroniclers, and it is plausible they were presented as such by the Byzantines to the Pope in order to solicit the aid of European Christians. Council of Clement. While the Crusades had causes deeply rooted in the social and political situations of 11th century Europe, the event actually triggering the First Crusade was a request for assistance from Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. Alexios was worried about the advances of the Seljuks, who had reached as far west as Nicaea, not far from Constantinople. In March 1095, Alexios sent envoys to the Council of Piacenza to ask Pope Urban II for aid against the Turks. Urban responded favorably, perhaps hoping to heal the Great Schism of 40 years earlier, and to reunite the Church under papal primacy by helping the Eastern churches in the time of need. Alexios and Urban had previously been in close contact in 1089 and after, and had discussed openly the prospect of the union of the Christian Church. There were signs of considerable cooperation between Rome and Constantinople in the years immediately before the Crusade. In July 1095, Urban turned to his homeland of France to recruit men for the expedition. His travels culminated in the Council of Clement in November, where, according to the various speeches attributed to him, he gave an impassioned sermon to a large audience of French nobles and clergy, graphically detailing the fantastical atrocities being committed against pilgrims and Eastern Christians. There are 5 versions of the speech recorded by people who may have been at the council who went on crusade, as well as other versions found in later historians. All of these versions were written after Jerusalem had been captured. Thus it is difficult to know what was actually said and what was recreated in the aftermath of the successful crusade. The only contemporary records are a few letters written by Urban in 1095. All 5 versions of the speech differ widely from one another in regard to particulars. All versions, except that in the Gesta Francorum, generally agree that Urban talked about the violence of European society and the necessity of maintaining the peace of God, about helping the Greeks, who had asked for assistance, about the crimes being committed against Christians in the East, and about a new kind of war, an armed pilgrimage, and of rewards in heaven, where remission of sins was offered to any who might die in the undertaking. They do not all specifically mention Jerusalem as the ultimate goal. However, it has been argued that Urban's subsequent preaching reveals that he expected the expedition to reach Jerusalem all along. According to one version of the speech, the enthusiastic crowd responded with cries of Deus Vult. However, other versions of the speech do not include this detail. Recruitment. Urban's speech had been well planned. He had discussed the crusade with Adhemar of Le Puy and Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, and instantly the expedition had the support of 2 of southern France's most important leaders. Adhemar himself was present at the council and was the first to take the cross. During the rest of 1095 and into 1096, Urban spread the message throughout France, and urged his bishops and legates to preach in their own dioceses elsewhere in France, Germany, and Italy as well. However, it is clear that the response to the speech was much greater than even the Pope, let alone Alexios, expected. On his tour of France, Urban tried to forbid certain people from joining the crusade, but found this nearly impossible. In the end, most who took up the call were not knights, but peasants who were not wealthy and had little in the way of fighting skills. In an outpouring of a new emotional and personal piety that was not easily harnessed by the ecclesiastical and lay aristocracy, typically, Preaching would conclude with every volunteer taking a vow to complete a pilgrimage to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They were also given a cross, usually sewn onto the clothes. As Thomas Asbridge wrote, just as we can do nothing more than estimate the number of thousands who responded to the crusading ideal, so too, with the surviving evidence, we can gain only a limited insight into the motivation and intent. Previous generations of scholars argued that the Crusaders were motivated by greed, hoping to find a better life away from the famines and warfare occurring in France. But as Asbridge notes, this image is profoundly misleading. Quote, he argues that greed was unlikely to have been a major factor because of the extremely high cost of traveling so far from home, and because almost all of the Crusaders eventually returned home after completing the pilgrimage rather than trying to carve out possessions for themselves in the Holy Land. It is difficult or impossible to assess the motives of the thousands of poor for whom there is no historical record, or even those of important knights whose stories were usually retold by monks or clerics. As the secular medieval world was so deeply ingrained with the spiritual world of the Church, it is quite likely that personal piety was a major factor for many crusaders. Despite this popular enthusiasm, however, Urban ensured that there would be an army of knights drawn from the French aristocracy. Aside from Adhemar and Raymond, other leaders he recruited throughout 1096 included Bohemond of Taranto, a southern Italian ally of the Reformed popes, Bohemond's nephew Tancred, Godfrey of Bouillon, who had previously been an anti-reform ally of the Holy Roman Emperor, his brother Baldwin of Boulogne, Huy, Count of Vermandois, brother of the excommunicated Philip I of France, Robert Curthose, brother of William II of England, and his relatives Stephen II, Count of Blois, and Robert II, Count of Flanders. The Crusaders represented northern and southern France, Flanders, Germany, and southern Italy. Unsla were divided into 4 separate armies that were not always cooperative, though they were held together by the common ultimate goal. The motives of the nobility are somewhat clearer than those of the peasants. Greed was apparently not a major factor. It is commonly assumed, for example by Runciman as mentioned above, that only younger members of a family went on crusade, looking for wealth and adventure elsewhere, as they had no prospects for advancement at home. Riley Smith has shown that this was not always the case. A crusade was led by some of the most powerful nobles of France, who left everything behind, and it was often the case that entire families went on crusade at their own great expense. For example, Robert of Normandy loaned the Duchy of Normandy to his brother William II of England, and Godfrey sold or mortgaged his property to the Church. According to Tancred's biographer, he was worried about the sinful nature of knightly warfare, and was excited to find a holy outlet for violence. Tancred and Bohemond, as well as Godfrey, Baldwin, and their elder brother Eustace III, Count of Boulogne, are examples of families who crusaded together. Riley Smith argues that the enthusiasm for the crusade was perhaps based on family relations, as most of the French crusaders were distant relatives. Nevertheless, in at least some cases, personal advancement played a role in crusaders' motives. For instance, Bohemond was motivated by the desire to carve himself out a territory in the east, and had previously campaigned against the Byzantines to try to achieve this. The crusade gave him a further opportunity, which he took after the siege of Antioch, taking possession of the city and establishing the Principality of Antioch.